Well, hello. My name is Will Watson, and I'll be doing the November-December Public Forum topic analysis for Champion Briefs over the topic Resolve the U.S.'s strategy of great power competition produces more benefits than harms. Quick note, I highly recommend that you invest some resources into Champion Briefs. It gives you a great outline of what arguments you're likely to see on the topic, along with some key evidence, especially if you're in a crunch for time. My background is I have a master's in international affairs from the Bush School of Government and Public Service. I did my undergraduate at Texas A&M University, and it got my major in international studies with a minor in Russian. So this topic is something I spent a substantial portion of my education on, which makes me especially pleased to be able to try my best to share a little bit about what I think about great power competition with you. Today we're going to do a couple things. We're going to start by talking about the framing and kind of the background of the topic. Then we're going to do pro and con, and finally wrap it up and try to get a good sense of what this topic is getting debaters to do. So let's jump right into it. If you watched previous Champion Briefs videos, you've probably noticed that we sprinkle evidence throughout for debaters to find. I'm going to give it all to you right up at the front with what I think you need to know, because the first thing about this topic is it is literature heavy. There is a lot of potential reading, and I'm not just talking about articles. I've never seen a topic where you should be reading so many big books. Couple of key books I recommend you read. First, The Theory of International Politics by Kenneth Waltz. It is great writing about the realist structure in the international order. Um, I'm going to use a couple of terms and I'll try to add definitions to them in a sec. You should give it a read. You should also read Peace of Illusions by Christopher Lane. Does a great job of discussing great power competition and how great powers interact from a defensive realist perspective. Also read Reluctant Crusaders by Colin Disick. Um, it does a phenomenal job of explaining some more of the problems with great power competition. Other things you should read. Look up How Does Great Power Competition End? It's in the National Interest, again by Colin Disick. Um, it does a great job of talking about what's the end game here. Finally, the Stimson Center has published some commentary on President Biden's national security strategy, which was released on October 12th. I recommend you give that a read. Then finally, the RAND Corporation released Understanding Competition, Great Power Rivalry, and Changing International Order by Michael Mazar. That was March of 2022. I'm giving you all of this up front because understanding the background on this topic is difficult, but it is critical to understand what you're doing here. So let's talk about that. Great power competition is vaguely defined, but seems to be well understood in most literature. It's generally accepted to be the US's rivalries with other large powers or large hegemons. This is usually to include Russia and China as the two great powers that the US engages in great power competition with. Essentially, this topic is asking, should we prioritize competition with Russia and China? Um, and I think it's a good question to be asking. We're sending a lot of money to Ukraine right now. We're cutting off some of the semiconductor dealings with China, and that doesn't come without a cost. Are the benefits worth the harms? I think it's a good question to ask and one that debaters are going to have a lot of fun with in November and December. Um, let's start by looking at the framing for this topic. So first, the U.S.'s strategy of great power competition produces more benefits than harms. Automatically, this gives the con world a strategic advantage, because if the con world can show that there are not more benefits than harms, they have two possible options. One, they could show that benefits are actually equal to harms and win the bout, or two, they could show that there are more harms than benefits. They have an extra option compared to the pro, which has a larger burden of proof. Um, this topic also is interesting because the US has pursued a strategy of great power competition for a long time. Um, after the Cold War, or excuse me, after World War II, the US engaged in the Cold War, at which point we were in great power competition with the Soviet Union. That competition defined the latter half of the 20th century. Excuse me. Great power competition was critical to a lot of our developments there. The recent time we've been out of great power competition was in the 90s, where the Soviet Union had fallen. We were the sole power, or the sole great power in the international order. But let's talk about these times when the US did not pursue great power competition, because in mm, in recent history, great power competition has been all we've been focused on. We focused on countering China, we focused on countering Russia. So, as I said, in the late 90s, we didn't pursue great power competition. Instead, we pursued a strategy of liberalism. Liberalism is the promotion of democracy, institutions, and trade. That is to say, that our focus was saying, hey, other countries should act with democratic principles. It places a high value on human rights and the promotion of these principles abroad. Um, whereas great power competition says, yeah, these principles are important, but what's more important is if we're able to contain our rivals. If we're able to stay, if we're able to dominate the game, we get to write the rules of the game. So let's focus on that instead. Another time we weren't focused really on great power competition was World War II. After World War One, Wilson was focused on liberalism, was focused on international institutions, but the U.S. was broadly focused on a much more self-interested policy. We wanted to see domestic prosperity. That's where, until the late 19th century, the U.S. was engaged with the world, but wasn't nearly as influential as we are now. I really recommend that you speak with some of your social studies teachers to get a better grasp of the history. This topic, while I love it as a graduate student, um, is not easy for freshmen in high school or anyone who doesn't have hours to spend reading heavy international relations or IR literature. Let me give you a brief synopsis of some of the IR concepts you're going to see. First is realism. Realism is a school of international thought that believes first that the state is the main actor. It also believes that the international system is anarchic or chaotic. That is to say that you have to guarantee your own security. No one else will do it for you. Um, there's a lot more to it than that, along with sub-schools of realism, such as neo-realism, defensive realism, and offensive realism. But I really recommend you research that. There's a lot of great YouTube videos about it as well. Another school of international thought is liberalism. Liberalism, as I said earlier, is the promotion of democracy, institutions, and trade. It assumes that there are structural constraints to the system, that you could build in almost barriers to constrain states' powers. Um, the final school of thought I want to briefly talk about is constructivism. Constructivism assumes that there are social interactions that go into the international order as well. Maybe President Putin isn't solely motivated by competing with the United States. Maybe part of it is an ego thing. I'm not saying that's the case. I'm saying that there are different ways to approach it. A lot of people try to boil down their politics to one of these schools of thought. In reality, our approach is multifaceted. We get to see a lot of different things, but the US has pursued a strategy of great power competition since, I believe, most recently the Obama administration. Um, Not that other administrations haven't looked at great power competition, but whenever whenever President Obama came in and said that we need to counter Russia and we need to counter China, that was really the start of the 21st century great power competition. So let's look at the late 1990s again. It's really an interesting time when we were the big power, the sole big power. We got to dominate a lot in the international order. We expanded NATO, which really aggravated the Russians. It still aggravates the Russians. We were able to do that because Russia did not have the same level of power it has. Russia was falling. The Soviet Union was crumbling. We felt confident in our authority, and China wasn't nearly the hegemon it is today. We were able to expand because we were strong. Um, that came at a cost, and we found ourselves involved in other problems. We did foreign interventions that we justified under humanitarian context, and we engaged in the global war on terrorism. I'm going to get in more on this in a second, but the global war on terrorism was not focused on great power competition. We partnered with Russia a lot in countering terrorism. We partnered with Russia a lot in countering proliferation. We didn't care that we were giving Russia a little bit more power as long as we were fighting those threats. And you can argue whether that's good or bad. The con world will define your individual debates. What I mean by this is the con world isn't well defined in the topic. What is the alternative to great power competition? Are we an isolationist nation? Are we a liberalist nation? What are we doing in the con world? I think the con should put forward an overview that says we negate resolved. Observation one, if we're not pursuing great power competition, we are most likely to pursue XYZ. One of the ways, and kind of me testing out this and writing a case myself, that I found was effective is saying it would be a strategy of liberalism. See President Biden's approach when he was in the legislative branch, and see our Secretary of State Anthony Blinken's approach, which both looked at liberalist policies. I think that could be an effective strategy. It assumes a lot of what ifs, though. As always, weigh this on framework and education to be able to get your message very cleanly across. But showing what the alternative is will help the con debate. The final piece of advice I have before we get into the pro and the con side of this argument is take an international relations intro seminar. And what I mean by that is look up International Relations Intro Seminar on YouTube and watch a 2-hour-long video. Getting a grasp of these concepts will help with your research. I know when I've been coaching on this topic, my students came to me and said, we have no idea what we're reading. We had to do that in class and talk through a lot of international relations theory so that they could read arguments and say, okay, if something is critical of a defensive realist policy, here's what side it goes to. Let's talk pro, then we'll talk con. Pro arguments for this topic are going to be militaristic in nature because we are arguing that we should compete with other nations. And one of the ways we do that is through the military. Excuse me. It's an effective way to try to constrain another power's power. That, hey, don't do this or we will go ahead and attack you. That brings me to the first argument, deterrence. Deter Russia, deter China. That, hey, we need to pursue a strategy of great power competition to stop China in the South China Sea and to stop Russia in Ukraine. One of the reasons we are giving arms to Ukraine is because Ukraine is able to bleed Russia dry. We want Russia to decline in power, and so we give the Ukrainians the power to do that. The pro could argue that that is a beneficial strategy. The pro can argue a lot about how power projection and appearing strong and competing is the most effective way to deter an adversary. Additionally, with all this, the pro gets the opportunity to say, hey, the other side gets a vote in this too. Just because we're not pursuing great power competition doesn't mean that Russia and China would all of a sudden say we're not pursuing great power competition. They may escalate their competition absent our competition to be able to better interact with the world and better exert their influence. Another argument, so first argument's deterrence. Check your adversaries. Second argument is tech growth. In the Cold War, great power competition was really great for technology because we wanted to have the best technology. We wanted to go to the moon, and so we invested heavily in that. It's possible that we are doing the same right now in fields like artificial intelligence, semiconductors, that this technology will have the opportunity to change the way we do things. There's a lot of domestic benefits to that as well, and really hammer down on, hey, investing in great power competition gives us this wide berth of benefits. The next argument I want to talk about on the pro is allies along with international security. Forming security alliances does lend itself to a liberalist perspective, but can be construed under great power competition as we are containing an adversary. With this, it comes in two ways. First are formal security alliances. Formal security alliances such as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization or NATO give you the opportunity to say if someone attacks one member, they've attacked all of us, and gives you bandwagoning capabilities against an adversary. But there are alliances that aren't as security focused. One thing that China has done is pursued the One Belt, One Road strategy that has given it substantial infrastructure along with debt trap diplomacy investments abroad. This has allowed it to compete more effectively with the United States and gave it significant influence in even Europe. Along nations that we thought were our close partners, China now has substantial influence. If the U.S. pursued an alternative strategy of great power competition where it focused on infrastructure investment abroad, this could really help countries in the global south build up their infrastructure. Great power competition has mixed reviews from a lot of middle to lower powers. During the Cold War, some of these countries really benefited. That the U.S. came in, we invested in them, we invested in their leaders, and then we left. Other countries really suffered. The US and the Soviet Union launched a series of coups. There were human rights violations abroad. There were massive, massive death tolls from the Cold War. Anyone who tells you the Cold War was bloodless is lying, or they don't know that the Cold War had proxy wars. There were deaths because of great power competition. One other thing that you can look at is nuclear proliferation. Japan doesn't proliferate because we guarantee their nuclear security. When that's been called into question, they consider proliferation. Having great power competition could be construed to say, hey, as long as we are close allies and we're containing, that means that we're able to effectively fight back against other countries proliferating because we're guaranteeing their security. Let's talk about the con arguments here. First con argument is domestic cost. There's a common international possibility production frontier in economics. It's a theory of guns versus butter, that the more domestic resources you produce, the less military you can produce, and vice versa. That applies here. Competing has a cost. We could do a lot more domestically with the money we send abroad to compete. So first argument's domestic cost. Second argument is non-great power competition threats. That, hey, the same way we were able to focus on countering Al-Qaeda in the early 2000s, there are still adversaries to counter. There are states such as Iran that we may need to counter. There's also states like North Korea that we may need to counter, but pursuing a sole strategy of great power competition means we are much more focused on countering China than we are on cooperating with China to counter North Korea. So non-great power competition threats should be a part of a con case because it allows you to link clearly into the military aspect. Finally, aggravation. Aggravation and deterrence are two sides of a coin. There's a chance when you flip it, you either deter your adversary or you aggravate them into attacking you. The pro wants to say deterrence, the con wants to say aggravation. This will be in almost every debate you have. I'd be shocked if it's not. So to recap, understanding this topic is going to be an uphill battle for most debaters unless you are an experienced debater well-versed in international relations theory. I highly recommend that you check out external resources. It's cold weather outside. I recommend get yourself a cup of coffee, cup of tea, sit down and read a book, and do some heavy international relations theory. I really have enjoyed the readings I've done for this topic. I hope you do too. One note on weighing for this topic, because if you've watched other videos that myself or other Champion Brief staff have been in, we like to talk about weighing. Weighing is going to be, again, critical for this topic. I think the impacts and the links are diversified enough that you don't need to pick one over the other. It will fluctuate round to round, but do weigh. Explain to judges why your arguments matter. But what's almost bigger than impact or link weighing is just weighing your warrants. There's a lot of gray areas with international relations theories where scholars make logical jumps, and those logical jumps can be taken out in a debate round. Best of luck with this topic. Y'all are going to do great. Take care.